The Redcoats, possibly the most distinctive soldiers in history. Yes, other nations had red-coated soldiers, and yes, British soldiers have worn other colours throughout history, but that bright, bold, unmistakable red remains one of the most enduring images of the British Army. These days you'll mostly see it on parade, worn by the guards or troops on ceremonial duties, but for the better part of 2 centuries it was the fighting uniform of the English and later British soldier. And given that I named this channel and podcast after it, it's about time we took a closer look at the origins of this iconic piece of kit. Unlike cavalry uniforms, which became, let's be fair, increasingly ridiculous, the standard red coat worn by infantry was simple and universal. It changed over time, usually because war had exposed some glaring flaw in the design, but for most of its history it was consistent across the army, apart from minor differences in facings, buttons and other regimental detail. It was practical, at least at first, until the development and widespread use of the rifle, but we'll come back to that. But before that, the distinctive uniform was actually an advantage. The red coat was feared, and not just by people who'd been to Butlins. Joke for the Brits, that one. On the battlefield, it allowed commanders to spot their own men through the smoke and chaos. Even if you ignore the command and control benefits, there was something reassuring about seeing ranks of your own red-jacketed mates standing firm beside you. But why red though? Red has long been a military colour. The Romans often get depicted in red. Yes, I know they wore other colours too, but the image has stuck. In English military history, red first appears in the late 15th century. More specifically, it has a Welsh origin. The yeomen of the guard and the yeoman warders, founded in 1485 by Henry VII, wore red uniforms. Henry Tudor had just won the Battle of Bosworth, seized the throne and wanted everyone to know his Welsh ancestry. The red came from the Welsh dragon, an unsubtle reminder of where he came from. So in a wonderfully ironic twist, the most famous English military uniform actually has Welsh roots, a fact that will no doubt delight and enrage Welsh nationalists in equal measure. During Elizabeth I's reign, English soldiers in Ireland were often seen in red. The Anglo-Spanish War saw pikemen in red coats, though not exclusively. James II's Honourable Corps of Gentlemen at Arms, previously the Honourable Band of Gentlemen Pensioners, that's a long name, also wore red. But at this stage it wasn't standardised. Individual regiments wore whatever their colonels fancied, really. That's why in the English Civil War red-coated troops could be found on both sides. And alongside them were soldiers in black, white, green, blue, yeah, you've got it. Inevitably this led to confusion, as you can imagine. That all changed with the new model army. Parliament wanted a professional uniformed force. Enter Venetian red. Why Venetian red? Well, it was cheap. Not quite the scarlet we know today, more of a muddy brownish red, but it was a start. More importantly, it gave soldiers a sense of unity. They were now part of a single army, not just a collection of individual regiments. Another reason was that the red dye was fast. Now, we don't mean speed. In terms of dyeing techniques, the term fast means that the dye didn't fade or tarnish quickly over time. Traditionally, the dye came from the rose madder or rubia tinctorum, although later cochineal, I've no idea how you say that, was used. Now, it certainly wasn't a new dye, as it was first reported being used back in ancient Egypt in 1500 BC. Treated with a solution of alum, it became a very effective red dye. Also, and this would become important for the future of the British Army, it was more resistant to fading in the sunlight. Yes, it did fade over time, but not as much as darker colours like blue or green because of the chemical makeup of the red dye. Whilst obviously that increased smartness, it also meant that the colour continued to stand out on the battlefield and be easily identifiable, an important factor on the battlefields of the 17th and 18th centuries. The first time the new model army's red coats appeared on the European battlefield was in 1658 at the Battle of the Dunes near Dunkirk. Yes, we were actually fighting alongside the French in this one. Weird times. 4,000 redcoats from Cromwell's new model army took part against the Spaniards. The Spanish were dug in, well positioned, well defended and expected to hold out. The French commander Turenne, however, wasn't in the mood to wait. He ordered an attack. The English contingent was led by Major General Thomas Morgan and Sir William Lockhart. It was Lockhart's own regiment that stole the show, storming a Spanish-held dune 150 feet high with such speed and violence that even the veteran defenders were caught off guard. After some brutal hand-to-hand fighting, the French joined the assault and the Spanish line broke. The battle ended in a decisive victory for the Anglo-French. Dunkirk fell and was promptly handed over to the English. More importantly, it kept Charles II sitting in exile for another 2 years and proved what many in Europe had started to suspect, that the new model army was no joke. Fierce, disciplined and terrifyingly effective, it had turned England into a power that could no longer be ignored. The red coat had arrived on the European stage, and for the next 2 centuries it became one of the most feared uniforms in the world. Now, just quickly, there's the old legend that red was chosen because it didn't show blood, adding to the soldier's aura of invincibility. That's probably overstated, but there's something to it. Now, I know you're a stylish gent or lady who likes to look good, and as epaulets and a hussar's dolman are no longer in fashion, I think attire like this is the next best thing. This is one of my new designs. It says Rorke's Gym Club, established 1879. I might even give some of these away on my next tour of the battlefield of Rorke's Drift. Let me know if you're interested in that. Now, Redcoat History t-shirts are made for those of us who know our balaclava from our Badajoz and who want the world to know it too. T-shirts, mugs, the lot. Stylish enough for the pub, historical enough for the battlefield. Ideal for anyone who's ever muttered, "Steady lads," while putting the kettle on. You'll find the shops here, redcoathistory.myspreadshop.co.uk and redbubble.com/people/redcoathistory/shop. Bit of a long title. Or you could just scroll down, keep it simple, the links are in the description. Every purchase helps support the study of British military history and keeps this channel marching forwards. Right, back to the story of the first and last redcoats. By the early 19th century, there was a bit of a compromise between practicality and parade ground aesthetics. During the Crimean War, the discomfort of the uniform did lead to a redesign. By the late 19th century, 2 versions existed, a thick scarlet coat for parades and a lighter, more practical frock-style jacket for marching and combat. But let's be honest, the red coat was never the most practical garment. It wasn't warm enough in the cold, and it was insufferably hot in warm climates. And for the record, it's worth adding that the use of the red coat wasn't just confined to the regular British Army. Units of the Canadian, Australian, New Zealand and South African militaries wore it, and although technically on the strength of the British Army between 1795 and 1927, the West Indies Regiment were another force that, raised in the colonies, wore the distinctive uniform. Consequently, it can still be seen today in the ceremonial units of such nations as our Australian cousins, the Canadians, New Zealand and numerous West Indian nations. The forces of the Honourable East India Company also used red, and not just for their European troops. The locally recruited units of the 3 Presidency armies of Bengal, Madras and Bombay all predominantly wore the red tunic, whilst some concessions were made to local dress elsewhere in the uniform. A bit like some of the other countries we've mentioned, this has lasted in some of the ceremonial uniforms of modern-day India and Pakistan. A good example of this can be seen in the impressive uniform of the President's bodyguard of the modern Indian Army, where the red coat looks very familiar. Similarly to our own household cavalry, they're not merely parade ground soldiers, but also an elite armoured reconnaissance unit in war. As Britain's army shifted towards colonial campaigns, alternatives were needed. In India, lighter shell jackets, boat coats and stable jackets became common. Often grey or white, they were much better suited to the climate. Campaign-specific uniforms also became a thing. Abyssinia in 1868, troops wore white drill uniforms by day but needed greatcoats at night. 1874, the Ashanti campaign, and Garnet Wolseley ordered uniforms in Elko grey tweed, one of the earliest moves towards practical battlefield dress. But bad decisions were still made. In the First Anglo-China War, 1840, Major General George Burrell insisted his men wear full regulation red serge tunics buttoned up while doing manual labour in 40-degree heat. Because nothing says great leadership like cooking your own soldiers in their uniforms. The move away from red in combat was gradual, but it was happening. The Corps of Guides in India had worn khaki since 1848. I've made a film about them and their role in the birth of khaki, so look that up on my India playlist. But khaki took time to catch on. Even in the 1880s, many believed the sight of red coats still had that psychological effect on the enemy. During the Mahdist War in Sudan at the end of the 19th century, British troops at Kirbekan were ordered to change into red coats before battle to show the enemy they were facing proper British soldiers. Even General Gordon, besieged in Khartoum, believed the mere sight of redcoats would overawe the Mahdists. Now, this was wishful thinking from a desperate man, but it does show the belief in the imagery of the red coat. The last official use of redcoats was also in Sudan at the Battle of Guinness or Jinnis, 1885. The British force included the Berkshires, the West Kents, the DLI, the Yorkshires and elements of the Cameron Highlanders. The Durhams had left their scarlet jackets behind in Cairo and turned up in dusty khaki, very sensible of them. Fighting alongside them were Sudanese and Egyptian troops, but they were dressed in a mix of white and khaki also. And the redcoats still worked because it was a good victory for the British, but I don't know if that was due to the enemy's fear of the red jacket or just the superior firepower. There were later sightings. British troops in the 1888 Civil War in Zululand wore them on patrol, and supposedly some Maxim gunners at the Battle of Firkay during, yep, you guessed it, Sudan again, 1896, were still wearing red. There are stories that some troops deployed to South Africa in the early years of the Second Anglo-Boer War in their red coats, but they certainly never took part in action wearing them. Against expert marksmen like the Boers, that would have been crazy. As the army had learned to their cost in 1881, look at my videos on Majuba and the First Anglo-Boer War. It was technically in 1902-03 that khaki officially became the service dress of the British Army, although as we've seen, practically this had basically already happened. Many regiments maintained red for ceremonial purposes, parades and walking out dress. So the sight of the red-coated soldier in the British Isles and Empire certainly didn't disappear overnight, and we still see it today, of course, a glorious sight to be sure. To many, for good or ill, it remains the image most closely related to the British Empire, the red-coated soldier. Special thanks to Dr. Chris Bryce for researching and co-writing today's episode. I'll link to his work below. I'll have another slice of British military history out next week. In the meantime, YouTube thinks you're going to enjoy the video that's on screen now. Check it out.